let me play you guys a little bit of a. Let me play you guys a phone call.
Good morning, Bongo.
Oh, hello there. This is Bongo here. Yeah, I'm at the Happy Day Stay retreat. Miss Annie's woke me up and says that they're talking about what happened to me back in '78. That's why I'm here.
Where are you exactly?
Happy Day Stays retreat, like a sanitarium.
Okay.
I was bringing a new vehicle down, brand new vehicle down from Balladder, heading towards Narrabri in 1978. In September it was 78, and heading for Tamworth, and I missed the turn off out of Narrabri to go to Guinea, and I kept going. I didn't know where I was going, and I saw these old mileage pegs on the side of the road. They'd been like painted over in those days, and I thought the engraver in it was a G, like for Guinea, but in actual fact they were a C for, turned out to be Coonabarabran.
Right, okay.
And about halfway along the road sort of thing, I started to get a bit concerned. The fuel was running pretty low, and in the distance I saw what turned out to be in those days, a telecom van heading my way. So I got out and I waved him down. It was pretty late in the afternoon, not just before dusk it was. Anyway, pulled up and he cracked the window down just a frightened little bit. And I said, look, I don't know where I am. Can you tell me where I am, mate? And he said, yeah. He said, you're in the middle of the Pilliga. Do you know where that is? I said, no, never heard of it. He said, what's your problem? I said, I'm nearly out of fuel. What? Can you tell me where I can get some fuel? He said, you're about the equal distance from here to Coonabarabran and Narrabri. It wouldn't matter. Anyway, I said, oh, I'm nearly out of fuel. I'd never get back. Anyway, I asked him whether he was going to Narrabri, and asked him whether he could ring the NRMA or when he got there or something to bring me out some fuel as I was a member.
Yeah.
And he said, oh, you won't get anyone to come out here after dark. And anyway, he didn't explain why, but
Right.
anyway,
So you were stuck
I
there?
ended up staying in this big old four-wheel drive all through the night, and about 3:30, 4:45, this thing just fair started to rock, and all these funny weird lights and that were dancing around outside, and I looked out, and what looked through the window at me is why I'm in this state today. He pulled the door off the hinges, and this thing, like it defies the explanation. What it looked like, it was horrific, and it took me through the bush a fair way.
So it grabbed hold of you?
And we ended up at this, I suppose you'd call it a humpy sort of a thing, and this thing had a real fetish, obviously, for real thin, bow-legged, knock-kneed, white, hairy legs. He had pairs of legs hanging up, and when he realised that I was no good to him, he took me back. He took me back to the edge of the road, whatever it was. I assume it was a he. If it was a she, there's something wrong in the world. But
Bongo.
I never ever saw him again. And a timber truck picked me up the next morning when it went through, and he took me to Coonabarabran, and it wasn't long after that they made me stay at Happy Days Day retreat, and I've been here ever since.
Bongo, that is just an amazing story.
And Miss Annie tells me apparently that there's some idiot out there in the middle of it somewhere last week or something, attempting fate. There's got to be something wrong with the person.
Can you give us a if I can't not pushing you too hard, what did it look like?
I can't explain it. It was horrible.
Pretty scary story there, Bongo, and thank you for that.
Oh.
And you look after yourself, okay? I'm going to pass your concerns on to Trev, who is our roving reporter, Trevor Chappell and Anna Mulder, who we've got out there in the Pilliga Scrub tonight. Bongo, thanks for your call, all right? You look after.
Okay, let's talk
Bongo?
about the Yowie.
Right.
I
Yeah,
just heard at the end
so-
he was pulling a fucking leg with that like monster.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was, I think, can be described as the sort of infamous Bongo call. It was originally recorded in 2005 off of ABC Overnight, which was a radio show that was recorded from 2 to, I believe, 6 a.m. 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. And so that was the caller, known only as Bongo. It is largely considered to have been a hoax, primarily because people have been looking into more details about what was going on with the call, and there's no such thing as Happy Day Stay Retreat. But it is one of those interesting calls where there hasn't really been anything that sufficiently proves or disproves it. So it kind of just floats around on the internet. It's a really fascinating piece of cryptozoological material because it emblematizes a lot of really interesting things about the Yowie and the discourse surrounding the Yowie, even if we have not actually had conclusive material about whether the Yowie actually exists. So yeah, let's do it. Let's talk about the Yowie. All right. So once again, everybody, welcome to Clearanceoncreepy. With me here, I have my host, Steve.
Yo.
And we have a special guest here. We have a specialist on the Yowie.
Who is it?
Introduce yourself.
Who is it?
That's you. That's you,
Oh, right. Yeah.
Okay,
Oh, hello.
yeah,
I'm Professor Jaden, studier of Yowiology.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you for having me on the podcast today.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Professor.
Well, you see, I graduated from Southern Cross University with a degree in bullshit, and then I did my master's in fakeology, and I've been studying the Yowie ever since, both personal and private. I often go out into the shrub, strip down naked, just trying to imitate various Yowie calls, just to see if it'll come,
So when we talk about the Yowie, where
brush
did
past
the origins of the Yowie come from?
I don't know.
Did it come from those Japanese books I've been hearing about?
Yeah,
Oh,
no.
okay.
Everyone always makes that joke. Ha ha ha! It's so funny. They have the same pronunciation. Ha ha ha.
You're telling me the Yowie isn't gay?
So as far as I know, the origin of the Yowie comes from kind of Aboriginal Dreamtime legends of like a sort of cryptid being. Like I don't know if the exact original version is the same, but like it has its like there are in certain like Aboriginal folktale, Indigenous Australian folktales, there it describes a creature that is similar to what most people think of as the Yowie. Yeah, but I am not 100% sure on the details. Even though I studied it at where did I say I studied? Southern Cross University.
Southern Cross University
So it's like
Which is a real university. That's not bullshit, but.
with a degree in fakeology.
Yeah, no, I had a degree in bullshit and a master's in fakeology.
See.
Yeah.
So it's like a hairy guy.
Yeah, it's so the descriptions of the Yowie is for anyone who never heard of the Yowie is considered, I guess, like an Australian equivalent of Bigfoot. The descriptions of Yowies tend to vary, but it's almost always some kind of ape-like man creature. But the descriptions tend to vary depending on the sighting. Some people say it's usually some details are consistent, like long gangly limbs and stout body, like size of like a gorilla, and it's got fur. But then other than that, like it can vary wildly in artistic depictions and this, that, and the other. The color of the fur, some say it's white, some say it's gray, brown, red. The shape of the shape of the head, how tall it is, the kind of limbs and stuff. It really depends on the individual sighting. There isn't that much of a distinct, clear image of the Yowie. And because every artist, the artistic depictions take so much artistic license in each individual one. Every time it appears in the newspaper where someone's like, so-and-so found a Yowie in their backyard, they've always hired someone who... I don't know if that's a case of there is a consistent description. It could just be a case that, like, people generally don't know enough about the Yowie, and so when the poor salaried artist from the newspaper is hired to draw a picture for "I saw a Yowie in my backyard" story, they have no reference to go on, so they just draw whatever the fuck they think the Yowie might look like.
I want to think of it as a guy in like a gorilla suit. That's what I'm seeing mentally right now.
Yeah. There's similarities to Bigfoot in that sense. It tends to be in like forested or like nature areas. But unlike Bigfoot, which tends to be seen as a shy creature, the Yowie is often seen as more aggressive.
Is it fireproof?
I don't know.
I mean, how's it going to survive all those bushfires? I don't see how.
Well, man, we're not fireproof, and we kind of survive them.
Yeah, you got a car.
Yeah, I got a car. You know.
Did the Yowie steal that truck? Does it?
It could do. Who knows? Yeah.
See Yowie just spraying himself with bottled water.
Yeah. We refusing to shake the Prime Minister's hand because he came for a photo op, and then he refused it because he didn't bring anything else.
Absolute state.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really funny that before we recorded, you preface this by saying, yeah, I know, like, overall, the average amount of info on this. And then you just come in with this very accurate summary of the Yowie.
Yeah. Well, it's, because I've this is one of the few cryptids I know a fair bit about. I guess it's just one, it's the national cryptid, right, of Australia, but it's also because, like, I know...
I guess it's the national serious cryptid.
Yes. And it's like, I know of people, like, through, like, a couple degrees of separation who claim to have seen Yowies. And it appears in, I swear, every year, once a year, in, like, the local tabloid newspaper, a Yowie. I saw a Yowie in my backyard. It was eating my oranges. Story appears,
So these people see like a homeless guy, and then they
yeah, right, yeah.
To be fair, they just saw me. I was the one stealing their oranges. They were tasty.
Yeah. Well, I do remember.
It was just Steve.
Yeah. Just Steve. Sorry, a bit peckish. Just came in. Yeah. Why were you naked though?
Well, it was hot. I'm not used to the climate.
That's true. Yeah. You came in the middle of winter. It's like 18 degrees, but you're like, oh my god,
this is too much for me. Okay. Over 15's a bit much. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. The interesting thing, like, there's also, there's a lot of hoaxes, like, the amount of videos that appear online, and probably the same frequency as the Tasmanian tiger, like people claiming they saw a Tasmanian tiger, but then it's a dog like 500, meters away, running really fast. People be like, I saw the Yowie, and then it'll be like their friend, their mate,
A blurry
just kind of wandering through the scrub. Yeah, wandering through the scrub. And, like, it's one of those things where it's like, half of them would have to be just jokes, right? Like, well, it wouldn't be funny if Johnny stripped down to his jocks and then ran around through the bush and we put it up and say we saw the Yowie. But then some people actually do pick it up and believe it.
I mean, you got to fill the newspaper somehow, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, so, okay. Let's talk about the Yowie in terms of its general history. So, I want to say that all of the stuff that you mentioned, Jaden, bang on. In terms of the research I've done, it's bang on. So
Well, I am Australian after all, so that means I'm qualified to talk about every single
every facet,
every
knowledge,
facet
yeah.
of Australian culture, history, everything. It's just comes with the territory, right?
So
Yeah,
I
and your
assume you're
degree
going to
too.
know all of the information that I'm just going to talk about, like
Of
innately.
course. I might actually. I'm just gonna go while you explain this stuff to Steve. You know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm the one that's completely in the dark now.
Yeah.
So the Yowie essentially refers to a cluster of hairy man sightings that have been part of Australian history since the 1790s. But it didn't really explode in massive popularity until the 70s when the field of cryptozoology actually became a thing.
I'm seeing a
It's-
correlation here.
So it largely...
So hang on. Can I just ask, when did the field of
Yeah.
cryptozoology actually become a thing?
in the late 70s and early 80s.
Yeah. Okay. And,
Yeah.
and where did that develop from? Was that from
It actually came from England.
Loch
There
Ness?
ended up being a journal. They actually created a journal called the Journal of Cryptozoology. And so it ran, I believe, from 1982 to 1987 or something. And so we're going to get into, or at least I'll get into, sort of like where the Yowie was really mentioned. But it really rode the wave of international attention as a result of sort of international cryptids really getting into it. Because the Yowie has actually been reported on in Australian media before the 80s. There was, for instance, a 1976 bit from about the Yowie where I don't know why they did it, but they interviewed a playwright, and it's the funniest thing ever because they interviewed some guy who's a playwright, and it's very clear that he was trolling this reporter because he was just like, yeah, I saw this thing come out. It was about 10 feet tall, and it grabbed my mate, and my mate was smashed up, and it pulled him up by his arm and ripped his arm off, and all the blood came out, and he was so freaked out by all the blood that he fainted, and my man was just like trying to get back up, but he's only got one arm now. And then like the reporter was just like, "Are you saying that your friend only has one arm?" He's like, "Yeah, it was absolutely crazy." Like he was
fucking
completely
playwrights.
deadpan the entire time.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
They're always giving these wild descriptions of stuff to people about cryptids.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting. Maybe it's a cultural thing. Obviously, it exists in in the United States and Canada and UK too. But I feel like there's such a sharp divide in Australia between people who are just like earnestly serious, believe all this bullshit, and then people who don't, but they find it insanely funny to be ironic and post about it. Like so. For example, if almost any time like a cryptid or like one of those videos are put up, right? If a video's like, I think I saw this, it's either someone who's completely bonkers and completely earnest about it, or someone who's just taking the piss.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's really funny because there was, and I'm going to mention it a little bit later on, but there was like a 2021 clip where they were talking about like the latest evidence on the Yowie, and they had one of those like run and gun cam setups where they just asked people on the streets, and they asked only two people. One was a girl who didn't believe in it, and the other one was a guy who did, and the guy who believed in it was just like, yeah, I mean, it's a big place. There's a lot, it's a lot of uninhabited land. I think there's yeah, absolutely. I absolutely think that there's something out there. And then the girl was just like, no, fuck off.
Yeah. That's about right. Yeah.
But there is something, I think there is something funny about the thing you mentioned, Jane, because when you take a look at, like, say, Bigfoot, people, like, who are into, like, Bigfoot, right?
Like Joe Rogan.
They're, yeah, like Joe Rogan. But there's oftentimes, Americans tend to be more agnostic when it comes to cryptids. They are often very much like, oh, I think it could be something. And then and then like they sort of like give it a lot more leeway. And I think it partly has something to do with just simply just how big the United States is.
Yeah. Well, how big the United States is, and how many different settlements, and like how diverse the biodiversity of the United States is.
Yeah,
Really,
they got
compare that to
bears
Australia,
over
where
there.
it's like 90% of it's desert. People live in like 2 places, like maybe 2.5, and yeah.
Yeah. So
Agnostic's a good word, yeah, to describe that, because
So there is a really interesting. So when you're talking about the biodiversity of Australia, there is something really fascinating that gets brought up, which is that by people who are sort of more who believe in the Yowie a little bit more. One of the things I do note is really fascinating is that Australia is actually quite unique in terms of its ecology, primarily because it was isolated for so long. And there is arguably proof that when the first humans landed in Australia, megafauna were still around. Gary Opit, who is one of the sources for this book, he does talk about how, like, it's possible that the Yowie might not exist, but it is also possible that something like a Yowie might have existed, and it's sort of been passed on through a lot of sort of oral traditions, especially through Australia's indigenous cultures. And this is something that I think is also really fascinating, which is that the belief of the Yowie between, say, the Australians or the descendant of like colonial settler Australians and indigenous Australians, because the latter group seems to believe in it a lot more readily.
Yeah, well, because it's more of a I don't know the full details, but like you said, it's more of like the oral traditions. It's closer to other stories of the dream time, and people don't seem to remember, or people
So
seem
I
to
guess
forget. But like,
can you explain what the dream time is to like people who are not familiar?
Right. So the dream time is like essentially the series of like the oral traditions left by Indigenous Australians. They don't really have so much of like any sort of written. It's essentially the background of like their religious beliefs. I'm not 100% an expert on it, and I don't want to like mangle it in a particular way, like try to misrepresent it. But it's one of those things where
Come on, Jay, you're the expert.
Well, because when we say Indigenous Australians, we're actually talking about hundreds of different tribes who have existed all across this ginormous country. Before, the British came and, like the British do, ruined
British.
everything. Yeah,
We do what we do. We do what we do. Come on, lads.
and we do it right.
That's like, come on, England.
Come on, lads, let's.
Colonize some
No, but,
fucking land.
All right,
But
lads.
because there's so many different tribes and this, that, and the other, there aren't so many like written records, like of that time, and a lot of it tends to be the oral traditions that like different tribes would have had different oral traditions, but then they blend and merge together and this, that, and the other. So the dream time just refers to like those sorts of stories that like essentially it's their like genesis or creation of the world before it ended up in this state, Yeah, and that's as much as I learnt in primary school.
Oh, they taught you well.
Yeah.
So I think, so I want to make a sort of a little bit of a content segue, because one of the things that people who would be listening to this podcast might think, okay, well, why are you talking about the Yowie? Why aren't you talking about, say, the Abominable Snowman or Sasquatch or Bigfoot? Because those are the ones that people would know. So in theory, you would talk about Bigfoot or Sasquatch first, and then you would talk about the Yowie, because there's oftentimes this imagination that the Yowie is like like an offshoot, like an Australian offshoot of Bigfoot. But in reality, if you actually take a look at the history of sort of, I guess you would call it the Abominable Snowman field of cryptids, the Yowie actually precedes Bigfoot by quite a bit.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
The OG.
Take that
come
cultural
on.
cringe,
But it is also really important to note that when these discussions about cryptozoology, and when we're talking about in Australia, and this is really fascinating because it's not a Clearance on Creepy podcast without me finding some way to find a problem with this. But the field of cryptozoology, even though it's a relatively recent thing as a cohesive field, actually has quite a lot of roots in Australian cultural anthropology.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh,
You should know this as the King of
Yeah.
Australia.
Oh, is it, yeah, right. The representative
The King of
Australia.
Australia,
Yeah.
So the reason why, right? It's important to note that Australia actually has a very unique position as a result of being, well, functionally isolated. But even after it was undergoing colonization, it was still a largely isolated location. And it's important to note that in addition to that, as colonization was occurring, this question of sightings in early modern Australian cultural anthropology had some really racist connotations.
Oh yeah, wouldn't be the
don't
history of
say.
Australia without racism. You know? Yeah.
And it oftentimes emerges out of this understanding of Australia as this sort of quote unquote untouched land, right? So it's so
Maybe at one point.
you essentially have this melting pot of
Yeah.
this very unique flora and fauna, this largely isolated area, this
Yeah.
quote unquote untouched land, and then this massive settler colonial identity. And then all of a sudden you have the beginnings of what functionally would become a very sort of the language of early cryptozoology. But it was oftentimes wielded in a way against sort of indigenous peoples, right? Because when we talk about what is Bigfoot, what is Bigfoot, what is Sasquatch, what is the Yowie, well, they're described as functionally bushmen, and sort of these sort of have their origins partly as a result of sort of, settler colonial imperialist rhetoric.
Right. Yeah. Dicey statements. Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I can believe that too because obviously again the isolation of Australia, the Sakoku period, if you will, of nature's Sakoku period. But
Australian Sakoku, yeah.
yeah. See, Japan got nothing on Australia. The indigenous kept that shit down locked for 40,000 years before the
They would
Brits
have kept
came
it
along.
longer if they could have.
Yeah, right. If the Brits had come, yeah. The funny. I just want to go on a little tangent. The funny thing about like they say Captain Cook, right? Is he's like, oh, the man who found Australia. It's like he wasn't the first British person to see Australia. He wasn't the first European, and obviously you have the indigenous, right? But like in terms of a foreign entity finding Australia, the first were the Chinese. Like
Of course.
Yeah,
Like in,
for,
like, the
the
1400s.
dick pills.
Yeah. And then they weren't the first Europeans because the Dutch landed off of the coast of Western Australia, and then it's just all desert, and said like, "Oh, this is a shit." That's just like
Yeah, so
I
a
can't
lot
do
of
a Dutch
people might
accent, but-
a lot of people might think that I'm making a joke here, but no, the Chinese actually one of the really important things is that the indigenous Australian states essentially they actually created a massive and very complex trading empire with China because China needed dick pills.
Yeah, they needed to get it up.
Yeah.
The Yellow River wasn't flowing, so good.
Oh
so.
yeah, of course.
Well, when it flows, but when it's not,
Yeah.
it might take another
Yeah.
generation.
Yeah, but so the isolation, right, makes sense because like there's all these things of like when the colonists were quote unquote discovering things that had already been discovered for thousands of years prior, but they called it a discovery to the Western world. They would discover like animals like the platypus, right, and like when the people would the people there would describe the platypus in the letters, the people back in the UK thought it wasn't real. They thought it was just like a prank, like they were trying to pull one over about the cryptid, and so then they would send the taxidermized carcass to them, and then they still wouldn't believe it because they'd be like, oh, this is a like a
It's a
otter that
fake.
you've whacked a duck bill. Yeah, they thought it was a fake and stuff like that. And so I can kind of see how Australia would play a big part in that because like we do have some pretty wacky animals here, and so
Well-
it's kind of I guess a logical step for people to think, well, something like ape men might actually exist.
Yeah, that's kind of a component from what I remember of these sort of like colonized exploration pictures and other things. Like if you've ever seen, there are like books that they've made of this, and they're like all super racist, but they it's really interesting because I remember, I can't remember, it was a couple of years back, maybe I was still in university, but there's this lost film which really like depicts this stuff. Where there's like this film about like a female like ape lady who has sex with men or something, and like that was a super popular film in the 20s.
Hell yeah.
And like it
get
was
a
based on
number,
that whole like colonizing stuff about like this idea of these sort of like, you know, this idea of the ape men or the missing link basically being a part of these like distant lands, if it be Africa or wherever, like that there's this entity in them that they're looking for. You know, it's just massive exoticism
Yeah.
mixed with
It's,
weird race stuff.
Well, it could also,
Yeah,
like,
it's-
considering, like, the 1800s and people still believed in, like, phrenology, and then, like, you know, the skulls of, you know, people of different ethnicities were actually different, so, you know, which is, you know, obviously pure bullshit, but founded solely off of racist science.
Well, it's not, it was just like a dude in his basement. He had 4 skulls, and he was just like, yeah, that's how
Yeah.
it works.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, so let me read to you actually, we do have arguably the first written down quote unquote sighting of Yowie, and maybe you can sort of see this sort of line blur between this idea of like Bushmen as natives and Bushmen as monster. So the first recorded sighting was actually in the 1790s when they were actually written down on a handbill that was actually meant to be distributed back in England, you know, back in the motherland.
England.
Yeah,
Classic.
England.
England, let's go to Greg's
And-
get us a pie.
You don't get pie at Greg's, you get sausage rolls.
Yeah. Yeah, sausage roll, okay.
And so one of the things, right, one of the purposes of the handbill was to sort of sell Australia as this sort of exotic land, and so it had these sort of stories that are associated with it. And one such story described an event upon which there was a wonderful large wild man or monstrous giant brought from Botany Bay. But they were able to quote-unquote capture it, and I feel like you would be able to sympathize with this, Jaden, because this is a very Australian thing to have happened. That it drank from a container of rum abandoned by sailors on an isolated beach.
Yeah.
So it just got completely shit-faced, and then they were just like, got him.
Well, that was just Barry, you know?
But that was the first like recorded quote-unquote example
Right.
that we have of like a potential
Right.
like, Yowie thing, right? But,
Yeah, but-
as you can see, it's often described as a wild man. You
Just
know?
a John Kerry
the-
dude.
It could have just been like poor indigenous man, or the, you know,
Yeah.
using wildly racist descriptions made it seem like made them seem like a non-human, you know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they've basically turned this into King Kong.
Yeah. King Kong, but it's just a dude.
Yeah, like well, he's like 50
just
feet
like
tall, and they're like, okay,
It's a
well, we
pretty
lied
big
things.
dude. It's like an
yeah.
Andre the Giant sized dude, but
Yeah, that's
like,
pretty big. That's,
yeah.
that's a giant.
it's pretty big, but you know,
Yeah.
people
Got
like,
shit
you know,
faced. Well, he drank a whole barrel of rum. I mean, come on.
yeah, that's how. Yeah,
Actually,
that's
if he was
Friday
that tall, I
night,
don't
you
think
know.
that could have got him drunk, though. Surely, proportionally.
So that is actually one of the things that's oftentimes mentioned, which is that like there is oftentimes this imagination of Yowies as like fairly short, like 4 to 5 feet tall, like
Yeah,
pygmy sized, or they're like huge as shit.
Yeah.
You know.
So
like
there's
10
a
to
famous
12 feet.
there's a statue in North Queensland in Kilcoy, I think.
Yeah,
where there's
Kilcoy. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a famous statue of the Yowie, and it looks like Coxsole Bubba, you know, like, you know.
Can you
Like,
can you
it
tell
looks like
audience what that
Beetlejuice,
is?
You know,
Okay.
like, yeah, it just looks like it just looks like this really like short, gruff looking goofy
Short
dude.
King. Okay.
Yeah, but then there are stories like I remember the last time I read the newspaper and saw, I think it was good 3 or 4 years ago, near my hometown. It was like, yeah, we found in the Gold Coast hinterland, and they had like this terrible artistic rendition of like, it was hilarious because the picture was like the picture looked like a yeti because it had like white. They described it having white fur or whatever, and so it looked like a yeti that was like doing like a paint me like one of your French girls
Oh,
pose. Yeah, and it was
Oh
like,
my
is this
God.
really the? Let me see if I can find it, because I think that shit would be hilarious. Yeah,
Yeah, we'll put the image in the show notes.
yeah,
That sounds great. I mean, that artist must have having the time of his life.
yeah.
Yeah. So we would start to see more So we would start to see more peppered recordings or writings about the Yowie sightings. We would see them in 1827, then 1837. We would see them in 1856, 1871. So there's actually quite a bit of them. However, the first sort of substantial record after the 1790 sighting actually came from in 1884 when a train crew reported in the Daily Colonist.
Is that real?
Yep.
Jesus
my
H.
God.
Fucking Christ. Yeah.
On July 4th, that they captured something quote-unquote gorilla-like, though resembling a man with forearms longer than a person, and coursed all with short, glossy black hair. The sailors named it Jacko and then sold it to Barnum and Bailey Circus, where it was exhibited around America and then shipped to Europe, and then it was thrown overboard when it died.
Oh my god.
There is a possibility that this could have actually been a hoax. However, the origin of the hoax came from a record from British Columbia, not Australia. So it's possible that there's some sort of miscommunication, or perhaps the Daily Colonist itself was actually the one perpetrating the hoax. It's very difficult to sort of trace back exactly how this was going on.
You mean colonists would
Okay.
lie?
I found the picture.
Yeah, who would have thought?
So if you guys want to see, this, I saw this in like a full, not a full page spread, but like this was a decent sized article in a newspaper that used this.
So you're
picture.
saying that a professional made this?
Yep.
Hell yes. Oh, I love that so much.
Oh my god, that's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah.
Isn't that just a
Alright.
monkey?
Yeah, it's like a yeti. Like it's like yeah. I don't know.
Like a long...
Yeah,
Is it a
so-
sloth?
Right, yeah, because it's really well. That's the thing. It's like the descriptions change because like even just searching Yowie, right? If you want to, if you just search Yowie, the spelling by the way is W. Well, you can see it in the title, right? But you know Yowei, not the other one because everyone's like, oh, it's like gay sex. But like you just search, you just get wildly different interpretations of what it would look like.
Are there any sloths in Australia?
No. Well, they're obviously the ones in zoos, but like there's no like
Yeah, not in the
native-
wild.
No.
Yeah, so when we're talking about sort of contemporary sightings, there would be continual sightings of what we might think as like the Yowie, but it wasn't actually referred to as the Yowie until the 70s. The first article that I could find, thanks to yowiehunters.com, came out in
and based-
1976.
Yowie Hunters. That's based in Cairns, right?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, right, yeah. Because I remember seeing I remember seeing them on the news once. Yeah. People take this shit seriously here. It's hilarious.
Yeah.
Not the film festival?
Not the film. No. Cairns, the town in tropical North Queensland.
I see.
Yeah, where you can see the Great Barrier Reef and various other marine.
I guess
aquatic
maybe
life.
the Yowie.
Yeah, so I want
work for
to
the
stress
Tourism
something that's
Australian Board,
really I want to stress something that's incredibly interesting about when we're talking about the people who are like oftentimes understood with regards to Yowie, right? Like some of these names, like you look at some of the names like, the Gilroys, Gary Opit, Lloyd Stepson, I believe. I might have gotten that name wrong, but when we look at like some of the people behind this, some of them are like legit, like they're like legit. Like some like I think
like established.
I think
like
I think Opit is
respected
like an
members of the
environmental
community.
scientist. Which is now to be clear, some of them, not all.
Yeah.
But it's a very different vibe than, say, for instance, American Bigfoot hunters, because American Bigfoot hunters are no more qualified to speak of anything than, say, like paranormal ghost hunters.
Right.
Like there's like guys who have all this tech gadgetry, and they're just like, I've conclusively demonstrated that what's been killing my cows is Bigfoot. You know?
That's great.
Yeah. You know, as he pops open his security camera with like 0 SD cards inside, he's just like, "There's no footage. Must have been electrical interference."
Yeah.
You know?
This creature has learned how to destroy my SD cards.
Yeah. The Yowie, he's financially ruined me. It's gotten me into crypto on all my email accounts.
God, such a powerful
Yowie?
creature.
You saved me.
But that's interesting, yeah. I guess because I don't know, yeah. Like it is more, like you said, like you know, there's more history behind it and like actual. Because the interesting thing about the Yowie is that, like, unlike say, well, I mean, Bigfoot, you know, obviously there are multiple sightings across different points in the United States, but the jury's out on whether people believe that like Bigfoot is a single creature or like a group of creatures, like an entire like species, but. Mm-hmm. Generally, when people talk about the Yowie here, it's this idea that like they are already a species. It's like they're few and far between, and maybe going the like extinct or whatever. But like people talk about like like Yowie specific. They'll say the Yowies, or like the Gold Coast Yowie, or the like the Cairns Yowie. They're speaking about specific sightings unique to that area because there's this idea people believe it's a whole species.
Yeah,
Right.
so they're treating the Yowie as like an actual like cryptid, like like a quote unquote like bona fide like zoology cryptid, which essentially just means like an animal that is speculated to exist but has no demonstrative proof yet. The example would be like the coelacanth, right, where people thought was extinct, but then we found out that they're still around. Like that was a cryptid, an actual cryptid for a very long time.
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing about the British, right? If they're going to colonize, a land,
here's the thing about the British.
yeah, they're coming to Australia, right? If they're going to colonize
they already
a land,
came. Don't worry about that. Yeah.
and there's going to be an animal there that is some sort of weird commodity to it, they're going to destroy it. They're going to kill it to extinction. So if it did exist, I can't really believe the British would have let it survive this long.
True, yeah, that's true. Like, I'll never forget what the British did to the giant tortoises.
Or the dodo.
Yeah,
dodo. So that's one of the things that I think Gary Opit mentions, right? Is that he talks about like if you compare the sort of early historical records, like talking about the Yowie, it's very similar to how people approached a dodo. It was this crazy, goofy monster thing that nobody took seriously until it turns out that, no, we did just fucking wipe them out. However, I think, we actually have, like, proof that the dodo existed.
Yeah.
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 Well, that proof from the Yowie could be coming through any day right now. We'll be looking like fools.
True.
We'll release this podcast. The next day they'll be like, definitive proof.
The interesting thing is, another thing too, is just that, like, when we talked about Bat Squatch, we talked about how, like, the only real commercial or pop culture visibility it had was in the IPA, right?
In the beer, right?
But in Australia, it's fairly commodified. Like, there is a
it's got chocolates.
there's a semi-popular chocolate like brand, and like that's like promoted around like Easter as like an alternative to like Easter chocolate,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
like a national treasure, then, right?
There's like I don't know about national treasure. But like, it's commodified to a degree because there'll be like. There'll be like stickers and merchandise and like really terrible like drawing books and like all this stuff, and like no one cares about it, but it's commodified, like kids aren't clamoring to like, Mom, buy me the fucking Yowie plushie or anything like that, but
that's not
it's,
the Yowie
it's
I
sold,
wanted.
it's
God
there.
damn it.
No, I wanted the green Yowie, Mom. No kids clamoring for the
they're clamoring for a different kind of Yowie, I know.
These days, his mum made a terrible mistake when when the son asks, "I want a Yowie comic," and it's like, "Oh, okay," you know.
I've been there.
But but when it's that version, it's almost always like this, like like you said, Joe, like this pygmy thing, right? It's always this like like this like almost like a fluff ball, like what's that thing from Fat Albert?
I'm not familiar.
Anyway, it's completely. It's usually we could put another
Short,
image in the
stocky, and
description,
angry.
but-
I'm guessing.
Yeah, it's used. Yeah, short, stocky, angry. It's that thing where like a lot of cartoons and like simplified things do, where like the head is just a part of the like a contiguous part of the body.
That has
You know
a
what I
neck.
mean? Like where there's no real neck. Yeah.
Just a thumb.
Yeah, and so it's interesting because you have these different like there's the wildly different visual portrayals of it, you know, from this little pygmy that's used to sell chocolates to a giant Yeti-sized man who apparently nearly raped a poor man from New South Wales, in that whatever we listened to at the beginning. That was what he was implying, right?
tale.
How he tried to rape
Yeah.
him, right? Yeah.
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 Um,
Yeah. My
So
favorite
it's-
part of listening to I didn't comment on that at the time because we're doing the intro, but I loved the part where he was like, where the dude said, "Oh, if it was female, then oh God help me, what's wrong with the world?" And the radio presenter was like, "Oh, Bongo, mate, you can't say that."
It's not really appropriate, is it?
Yeah. He's like, "Oh shit, we can't put this on the air." Oh no.
yeah. That's the. I feel like that's the most real. That's the most compelling piece of evidence as to why that might have been like a legitimate call and not like a radio faked one. Because like they, I feel like a radio host would be like, okay, you can't say that.
Yeah, you can't say stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that could have been like obviously like I think if that dude was probably schizophrenic if it was real,
Yeah.
like probably had some sort of troubles, not the Irish kind.
Different one, yeah, I'm aware.
Different one, yeah.
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 you were
So
saying-
it's funny
Oh, go ahead.
because Yowies and sexually assaulting men is a pretty frequent occurrence in the reports.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so one of the first reports of Yowies that referred to them specifically as Yowie is a report from 1976 on the Maclay Argus about George Gray, who was attacked by what he described as an ape-like creature standing 4 feet tall, gray hair that's about 5 to 6 inches long, with a face like a human, though it had a sort of a walking gait like an animal. It pulled him out of bed and then just tried to drag him out of his house, but he kicked it and it ran off. So that was like so it seems that like dudes being potentially violated is a thing that seems to happen often with Yowie reports.
And now I'm thinking about it, like you were saying that, like that also like reeks of its roots in like kind of colonial
Yeah.
racism, right? Because like the portrayal of like the
The
native
bestial
people
man,
as-
right?
Yeah, savages,
Yeah.
savage, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's always come back to colonialism, man.
Well, I mean, I guess in that way it's public domain, though.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. So you were talking. You mentioned that like from this or last year there was a sighting
Yeah.
of particular interest.
So let me get to a few of the little bits and pieces of the history first.
Okay.
When we're talking about the history of like Yowie sightings in the sort of field of Yowie cryptozoology, most of the times we're going to be looking at Rex and Heather Gilroy. They're still actually researching Yowies. There's also Gary Opit, as well as Lloyd Stapleton. Most of the evidence they've been able to accrue have largely been like casts of footprints. So foot sighting, feet print, right? Have largely been the primary example of Yowies that people have been able to find, but there is something that I quite respect about people like Stapleton and the Gilroys and Opit and all that, because they all, as far as I can tell, they all kind of agree that this is not sufficient evidence. Gilroy, for instance, has gone on numerous interviews and been all like, I'm still trying to look for evidence of like Yowies. And he's got all these footprint castings and whatnot. He's like, this isn't evidence. So I kind of respect him for that, because in America, that would have totally been evidence for Bigfoot people.
The bar is lower in America, I guess.
You know, they would have been like, got him.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, well, like you said, like the way you described it, like the cryptid, well, like that sort of, the paranormal culture in America and like, well, North America in general, because I assume Canada is similar, but like the agnostic is more like a good term for it, right? Like people are more like, oh, I don't know, it could exist, this, that, and the other. But Australia, it's either you really believe in it or like hard atheist. Nah, that's bullshit. Yeah, shut up.
Cynic.
Yeah.
Fucking hairy little man, get the fuck out of here.
Yeah, get the fuck out of here. Come on, what are you doing?
I wonder how much of it, and this is going to sound comical, but I wonder how much of it boils down to, say, cryptozoology prestige. You know, because even though cryptozoology is much bigger in the United States and much more varied, Australia's cryptozoological sort of community or corpus is much older.
Yeah, it could be that, yeah. Well, it could also be because of that, like, you know, the pool of cryptids is shorter, like smaller in Australia, right?
Yeah.
And
could be coming from, I guess, the people working on it being like of a higher caliber in their degrees.
Yeah. It could also be that, like, you know, there are fewer media outlets that will, like, obviously they do end up in the newspaper all the time, but there are fewer major media outlets for them to end up on, you know, because there is only, like, you know, a handful of major cities, especially like in like the 70s or 80s, you know. There were only a handful of cities with any sort of like media conglomerate that could reach a wide number of people. So, you know, without a more sturdy like base of evidence, or, you know, it's like
that is true. Australia's only had about 30 years of electricity.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Yeah. We put on our stamps, you know.
I don't know if the news, the level on the news is like more strict on that or not.
I wouldn't say it's strict. It's just because there are fewer news channels, right?
So you have to be more concrete, I guess, with your evidence.
Yeah. Like it's more competitive, I guess. That's, like, would be a thing for, like, if you're doing the fluff pieces. It's Yeah,
because I mean, if you say that you can get one in every town, there can be every town that's like, oh, ain't my baby or whatever.
Yeah. Okay, that's not. Yeah, come on, man. That's not a. That one was some real shit, you know. Come on. She got fucked, man.
Yeah. I think so. On the subject of the whole sort of like dingo thing, I think there's something, again, right, really fascinating in terms of the sort of the racist element that has sort of emerged out of that. Because I remember reading a little bit about like the sort of the discussion that was happening at the time, where she said, you know, like, you know, the dingo got it, and if I remember correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of indigenous people actually came out in support of her. We're just like, dingoes really will fuck you up.
No, they did, yeah. Yeah, no.
And nobody believed them, because they were just like...
No, there's an awful part of that story where there was someone who was going to testify. Mm-hmm. There was an Aboriginal man of pretty high stature, like, you know, in the community in that area, and he was going to testify at, like, her trial, right? And one of the main police involved with it went around to his house, dropped off a case of beer, got him blind drunk before, so that he was, like, incapacitated and he couldn't actually go to the trial.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
That's horrible.
Yeah. When you're talking about, like, Central Australia, it's like, whew, shit's still cooking. Still cooking, you know?
And that's like, what, 20 years ago?
Yeah,
that's only in, like, the 80s, 90s, you know?
What purpose would there to even do that? Is it just the bitterness?
Yeah. I don't know, they had their story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, like,
anyway.
again, right? That's one of the sort of, I think that tension, that sort of racial tension, once again comes up in like the Yowie because, as I mentioned, indigenous people seem to take this much more seriously than like white Australians do.
But white Australians don't really take anything seriously. As no doubt you've seen time and time again on this podcast.
Yeah. So what would be? So let's talk about the evidence, right? What's the most recent evidence? Well, so in 2021, there was a thermal capture of an object that they believe to have been about 9 feet tall,
Oh, for fuck's sake.
which is really big, right?
Oh wow, 9 feet. It sounds suspiciously familiar.
They're always 9 feet tall.
Yeah.
Oh my god! And then he had bat-like wings.
Didn't know it could fly that far.
Yeah, a volcano was exploding in the background. There's like, oh my god, bat squatch.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So anyway, the thermal capture.
Yeah, I was going to show the clip, but it's very boring.
Okay.
That's fair. Don't bore us.
It's
just
very,
take your
very
word for
The last thing we need to do is bore the audience.
And I also
Yeah.
think I may be copyright claimed by,
Toei.
yeah, Toei. Yeah. I may be copyright claimed if I do it, so I
Yeah,
want to
they
kind of
got
avoid
the-
that.
Again, they made the classic mistake of they got the wrong Yowie. So.
Yeah, of course. Again, as always.
Yeah.
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 It's also one of those things where it's just so big. I mean, like we can't do like Yowie in one episode. There isn't a lot of stuff that I can point at and be like, oh, this is like a sort of the breaking point. This is like this is the person we got to focus on. These are the events, right? It's not like the Loveland Frog where it's just like these are very clear events because there's so little information that you can just kind of like you can give a timeline. With Yowie, there's so much material out there. There's so much siphoning that has
Hundreds
to
of
go.
years,
And-
as you said.
Yeah, and one of the things that I mentioned, there's one of the things I went on to like Australian Yowie Hunters or yowiehunters.com.au or whatever, and the thing is, they keep track of every single phone call they get about people who have supposedly seen or encountered Yowies, and the thing is, there is a point where in creating the notes for this podcast, there was a part of me where I'm just like, okay, I'm gonna read through as many of these as I can, as many of these as I can,
God, dear.
and I'm gonna pick out the funniest ones, right? You know, I'm like, yeah, guys, listen to this hilarious Yowie stories. Wow, that's crazy. But I couldn't really find them because the thing is, I think most of these people are legitimate in terms of like the fact that they probably felt like they saw something.
Yeah.
And so, like, that becomes a sort of situation where it's just like, I don't know, if I'm laughing at, like, I think there's nothing wrong with laughing at like comical circumstance. You know, if somebody was just like, I'm dragging the pussy wagon, on the way to Perth, and we're just like, this guy's car, he calls it the pussy wagon, right? But like. There's something different between like something that's incidentally funny versus something where it's just like a woman feels legitimately scared for her kids because she thought she saw something in like the Pilliga.
Yeah, well,
Like-
especially like even from like the idea of the idea of like humanoid cryptids, right? Why people tend to find them scary in general is it's the fact that it's like the perversion of the human figure, right? In the sense, it's like if they see something that looks vaguely human staring at them from the distance, but it's not like, because obviously most of these sightings are either that's why they're mostly either at night or when they're disoriented or from a distance and this that, and you can't make out 100% whether it's fully human or not.
Yeah.
And that's where the scary part comes in.
Yeah, or like the fear of latent homosexuality, apparently.
Yeah.
Yeah, there never really was a story where it's just like, yeah, me and my friends were backpacking across Australia, and then we saw a Yowie with a gun and a cowboy hat.
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
He said something like something Malott. It's just like,
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Like there never really was a story like that, right?
Yeah.
It's just like, oh, this is something that I don't feel horrible about being like, come on, man, get the fuck out of here. Like most of them were literally. And the thing is, most of them don't have a lot of like the telltale details of like what I consider to be like bullshit like stories where like they're very specific. They have like these very clear, vivid details because they're just constantly running the story. A lot of these sightings are very sort of mundane in a lot of ways. A lot of them are just like, yeah, I was just walking my dog and then, talking to a friend of mine, and we just saw like these giant ass footprints. And that's it. You know? And this is one of those situations where it's just like, okay, well, they want it to be anonymous, so they're not doing this for attention, and the details are not enough that they're just like, I'm going to weave a story to mess up with these guys. These feel like legitimately like people who want to provide like data to something that they believe is treating this thing seriously. You know?
Yeah.
So, of course, that brings us to the question. Do you believe it's real?
No.
You're the Australian here.
I'm the Australian.
You have to believe it's real.
Yeah.
He lives in your
Why?
back garden.
Yeah, dude.
Yeah, no, that's not...
Literally your
that's
back
just,
garden.
That's just Dave, you know?
Look,
He
okay,
comes
I
here
believe the
foraging for
Wendigo
berries
is
sometimes.
real.
Yeah, do you really?
No.
Yeah, see, there you go, you fuckwit, you know?
So there is there is an argument that Wendigo might exist in a conceptual sense, because what a Wendigo is somebody who goes crazy and then eats people when they
Right.
are in the middle of the woods. So it's just like, oh, that just describes like
Psychosis.
deeply destroyed psychosis.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Bath salts or something.
No, I think the Yowie is like, I just think it's a collective term for a whole bunch of sightings for things that people can't 100%. Because it's kind of like the opposite problem for me. The Yowie has the opposite problem for, say, something like Bat Scorch, where the details are always exactly the same and too specific. For the Yowie, it's too wild, you know, they're too wildly similar, you know, ranging from 4 foot to 9 foot, like, you know.
Yeah, they seem way
man.
too different. There's no consistent sort of thing.
Yeah. And so, like, what I believe is, you know, I believe, obviously, like you said, like, I believe these people saw something. You know, they think they saw something, but I don't think there's no such thing as, like, a unified Yowie species or unified, like, I think it describes a whole different bunch of other phenomena that people...
Sounds like a lot of the time they
collectively...
just see a person.
Yeah, like a person or... Like I said, Australia's weird fucking animals, you know?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because Gary Opit actually makes the argument that, like, Yowie might have been sort of like the descendant of, like, Homo erectus or Australopithecus africanus. But that's all speculation. There's no evidence for that.
Yeah.
You know, we don't have any evidence for that.
Yeah, it's just, and no, I don't believe it. You know, I don't believe in any of this shit. So, you know,
God damn.
That's why you have me on this podcast, right? Yeah. Well, I mean, today because I'm a special guest, because I'm the Yowie expert. But
Well, one of these days, I think Joe's hoping to convince you otherwise.
Convince me of something. Yeah,
like
one episode will just come on and I'll be like, well, you know, that's not cryptid. What are you talking about? That's real.
Platypus. Why are we talking about the platypus?
We're going to talk about the paranormal. We're just talking about something that's real, you know?
Yeah, it's going to be something wild. I'm going to be all the thing about spring-heeled Jack is. And you're like, wait, what? No, spring-heeled Jack is
No, spring-heeled Jack was real. What are you talking about?
I've seen it, you know? Yeah.
He's a steampunk leprechaun who sexually harassed women during the Victorian era.
Yeah, and he spat fire and such.
Yeah, he spat fire. Yeah, he did spit fire.
Yeah,
he's fucking awesome.
Yeah, spring-heeled Jack. What a crazy... he
Master of parkour.
He's a Tim Burton villain.
Yeah. Well, we can get to him when we get to him. So
Yeah, of course.
That'd be a good one.
That's when we're gonna have to bring in our that's when we're gonna have to bring in our expert, Steve.
Yeah.
yeah. Well, and also just something I thought of, like we were laughing at the dude for saying it's a female kind of thing, but with a lot of these cryptids, like there is a tendency to kind of one if they're not seen as an actual whole species and just like a one-off mutation, like whatever, but there is a tendency where almost all of them are described as put forward as like almost always universally being male.
Yeah. Like, where's Moth Woman?
Yeah, right.
We need fan art,
we
people.
need girl boss, girl boss Moth Woman.
Yeah, Moth Woman.
I mean, who says they have to have any clear gender? I mean, they're like
no, that's
creatures.
true.
Like, the rules of the animal kingdom are quite wide.
They could reproduce asexually.
That's true.
Or
That's
whatever,
true.
Yeah. Yep. So, for people who are probably excited for the Yowie, very sorry that most of it was literally just a discussion about Australia's racist past.
Yeah.
That's how we get them.
But before you judge us, your own country's just as fucking bad.
Yes.
What, you mean England is bad? No, it can't be true.
Yeah. Yeah, who do you think created this whole mess in the first place, huh?
Yeah. A country that's had zero racial issues?
Canada.
That's right.
Yeah. Nothing
Yeah,
ever.
I've certainly never heard any
Nothing.
controversies of late about Canada and
Nope,
indigenous
no
culture.
controversies
schools
whatsoever.
No.
Our schools are pristine and managed very well, especially by Catholics.
I've never heard of story of Catholics doing terrible things in the past in my country or otherwise. That is certainly true.
Clean as a whistle, baby.
Yeah. I kind of wish the Yowie was real. No reason. Just be cool.
It would be kind of cool, wouldn't it?
That would be hilarious. Just this idea of just like
Wouldn't
the Yowie being real. Just like how well would it smash on Tinder?
Yeah, right. Yeah, damn. Well, because they never talk about the size of its cock, but that's probably consistently
Yeah, it depends where it is on
bulging
the
and bursting.
on the timeline, I guess. Because if it's like a gorilla, then it might not be too impressive. But
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
That's true, yeah.
yeah.
but maybe it's like a baboon.
humans
It
of
might
all
be a little
primates.
bit crazy.
True. Well, yeah. That'd
All
be
right,
cool.
so-
we could. Oh,
Oh yeah, go on.
I was gonna say we could use it as like if the Yowie was actually real, then that'd just be another facet that Australia could pimp out its natural wonders for the purposes of tourism. Like, come see the Yowie.
I mean, that's wasn't that the original intention to begin with?
Yeah.
Okay, so next episode we are not going to be covering anything. We are going to be doing spooky, scary story time as we read creepypasta. Yes. So
Wow. It's gonna be too scary for me.
So you must listen to the next episode at night and at night only.
At 3 a.m.
Yeah.
specifically.
Yes.
3 a.m.
Wait, what?
Yeah. And keep your phone handy just in case Freddy Fazbear calls.
That's
watch
true.
out
Not
for
you. You're not calling
hyperealistic
him.
blood.
He's gonna call you.
He's gonna call you.